Welcome to 17th Annual International Conference on Central Southwest Asia. This is an elite force, so be prepared for it. We have 5 excellent presentations. They're going to impress you immensely, and 15 minutes each. And after presentations, we're going to have 5-10 minutes for questions, and they're going to be Sean, Jacob, Isaac, Chris, and Kelchi. I want each of these people actually talk a little bit about themselves. This is the difference between intelligence and knowledge. This is like you will see the best type of research that has been done for some of these presentations. So intelligent people, very important, but then intelligent combined with knowledge, you see how it goes way beyond imagination of all of us. Please welcome Sean, and then we're going to go, since we are compact as far as time, we're going to go each for 15 minutes, and then hang on to your questions. At the end, when everybody is done, you can have your questions, general question or personal questions. Please welcome all of them, especially Sean, starting point. We're going to start where we left off here, the last presentation on India, Pakistan. Then we're going to go to the Levant area, to Iraq, Syria, and then Holy Land, Israel, and then beyond that, to Central Asia.
Hey everyone, my name is Sean Kitson. I'm a senior here. I major in Central and Southwest Asian Studies as well as History, and I minor in Arabic Studies. I appreciate the opportunity for me to present some of the research I've been conducting over the last month or so. So yeah, let's get it started. I started out this presentation with a quote. I thought it really embodied the conflict between Pakistan and India and what it's become. It's a sense of national pride between the two. It's a sense of national identity and a stubbornness on a very high political level. Admittedly, I was fairly ignorant of this situation as a whole, and I thought these were some of the questions that I tried to answer through my research and through this presentation, and hopefully I'll be able to answer if you guys have similar questions like this. So first off, where is it? Where is this conflict taking place? We go to the subcontinent of India, and we see India and Pakistan, the two main belligerents in this conflict. And we see the highlighted Kashmir to the northern tip of India and the northeastern part of Pakistan. We zoom into Kashmir. Well, this is the Kashmir of today. We see it is divided along the line of control between Pakistan-administered Kashmir and Indian-administered Kashmir. The Indian-administered Kashmir is also known as Jammu and Kashmir, while Pakistan-administered Kashmir is also known as Gilgit-Baltistan. Without the messy political lines, Kashmir, we see Kashmir for what it is. It's a western Himalayan valley with 13 million for its population, and it is 86,000 square miles. This is the most populated city in the region, in the Indian-administered Jammu and Kashmir region, Srinagar. It is home to 1.2 million people, and much of the civil unrest that we've seen over the last 72 years of the conflict, and is the historical capital of the greater Kashmir area. Here's some cool pictures of Kashmir. It's also known as the Switzerland of India for its Alp-like, the Himalayas, just beautiful, lots of skiing. There's natural beauty everywhere in this region. It has a very rich and ancient culture, and tourism today, even in the midst of conflict, is still part of their economy. So, how did it start? Where did this conflict start? If we saw the great presentation before this about the British partition of India and Pakistan, unfortunately I have to gloss over it and won't go into detail as much. The end of the British Raj in 1947 creates the Republic of India and the Dominion of Pakistan. These borders were drawn essentially arbitrarily on estimated religious lines. The consequence of this partition was massive amounts of unrest and violence between Hindus, Muslims, and Sikhs. East and West Pakistan was for the Muslims, and India was for the Sikhs and Hindus. 14 million people were displaced, and an estimated 300,000 to 2 million people killed in religiously fueled violence. A mutual genocide of sorts took place between previously peaceful communities. And if we look at this map, we can see before Bangladesh was Bangladesh, it was known as Eastern Pakistan. And we see Kashmir again is highlighted. And we can see it says status uncertain. This is because, I guess I'll get to that. Princely states of the British Raj could decide which newly formed country they could join. Maharaja, the leader of the state, Hari Singh of Kashmir, was a Hindu, and he was Maharaja to the predominantly Muslim population. He did not choose a country to join, he just did not answer the question. The Muslims in Kashmir started a civil revolt known as the Poonch Uprising. When the Maharaja began to suppress their revolts, Pakistan invaded and began the war against Kashmir. The Hindu Maharaja, seeking help, asked India for help, and that's when India got themselves involved, and it was the first formal conflict between the newly created states. A little over 2 years later, the United Nations passes Resolution 47, which creates the line of control we see today and ends the violence. India has military control over the southern parts and Pakistan over the northern part. And this, another picture like the previous one, we see the line of control. And these are not international borders. This is a de facto border, merely separating the spheres of military influence between Pakistan and India. These are just some of the wars after the first one. These are some of the greater standoffs, crashes, and altercations between Pakistan, India, between India and the Kashmiris, and the Sino-Indian War in 1962 is between India and China. This brief war ended with China taking parts of the Kashmir Aksai Chin region. Standoffs and skirmishes usually involve either civil unrest with rubber bullets and tear gas or shots fired across the line of control by Pakistan and Indian forces. This can be heavy shelling, sniper fire, small arms. An estimated 47,000 deaths have occurred since this first war, and this does not include civilian kidnappings and forced disappearances, which could be in the thousands as well. And it is very hard to find accurate statistics in these types of conflict zones, especially when either government is releasing different news, their biases in the news. Who's involved is also very important, and we'll look at who's involved on the micro issue of the Pakistan, Indian, and the Kashmir unrest. These are a couple of the groups. We see Lashkar-e-Taiba, which is an Islamic terror group established in 1987 and responsible for the continual uprising in the Kashmiri insurgency. They have an incredibly large network all across Southeast Asia, one of the most powerful in the region. And their goal is to wage jihad in Kashmir and liberate the Kashmiri Muslims from Indian oppression. With very close ties to Lashkar-e-Taiba, we have Jaish-e-Mohammed, another Islamic terror group, and they're responsible for some of the more infamous attacks in Indian history, with the 2001 attack on Indian Parliament and the 2008 Mumbai massacre, and as well as the most recent Pulwama attack in 2019, which I will be getting to. And with similar goals, they want to merge Jammu Kashmir into Pakistan's authority. Lastly, not a terror group, we have the Jammu Kashmir Liberation Front. It is a political organization which is present on both sides of the line of control, and they are fighting for a secular, independent Kashmir, free from any foreign rule. They have a lot of trouble getting recognition from either state, but they're the only really predominant political organization in the region. Now, since that was predominantly focused on Pakistan, we'll look at Indian groups. As you'll notice, these aren't terror groups, but these are the organizations which are present in Kashmir right now. First, we have the Indian Border Security Force. It is the largest border security force in the world. It is under the authority of the Ministry of Home Affairs in India. It focuses on counterterrorism measures, and it has been accused and held accountable for many human rights violations, including voter suppression, extrajudicial killings, rape, forced disappearances, truly awful things. Next, we have the Central Reserve Police Force. They are under the authority of the Ministry of Home Affairs. Again, they are a paramilitary force, and they are focused on counterinsurgency and also terrorism. They are also the predominant occupiers of the Kashmir, Indian-administered Kashmir. And they, similar to the Border Security Force, they have been accused of countless human rights violations. Thirdly, we have the Bharatiya Janata Party, which is a political party, one of the most predominant in India, one of the two major ones at the moment. And their rhetoric is very right-wing and Hindu nationalist-oriented. And their official policy is trying to get Kashmir into direct authority in India, because at present moment, Kashmir is in a very kind of gray area, whether they're controlled by India as a state or as a colony, essentially. So they're trying to really take Kashmir as it is. What are the global implications? Why does this involve us? Why is this bigger than just the Kashmir region? Thank you. India is strongly connected all around the world. They have very large arms agreements with Russia and Israel. They have strong economic influence throughout the world. They are the third largest economy, and they can use this economy. As Professor Key was saying earlier, they are a world power. They're not just rising to become one. They have been a key player in the war on terror and the war in Afghanistan for the U.S. and NATO. If we look at Pakistan's relationship with the world, it's a little different. They have very strong economic ties to the EU and very close relationship with China, Saudi Arabia, and many of the Gulf states. They are considered a major non-NATO U.S. ally and have been incredibly key to the war in Afghanistan due to their geopolitical location. And China has invested billions into infrastructure and the economy in Pakistan through their Belt and Road Initiative. A very important factor in this issue is the use, or the lack thereof, but the arsenals which both countries have with nuclear weapons. They each have estimated over 100 nuclear warheads, and neither of them are signatories on the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which is internationally recognized. And while they're not signatories on these international agreements, they do have about half a dozen bilateral agreements on their no first use policies and their testing policies. And I wanted to show this map to show only really a handful of countries have this power, and it's pretty important that two of the countries which have nuclear weapons have been in many wars and are still very contentious to this day. This is kind of a brief summary of the rhetoric and propaganda put out by each country. Pakistan views India as a oppressive human rights violators against the Muslims, while India views Pakistan as a state sponsor and state supporter of Islamic terror in the region and abroad. And it's important to think of the Kashmiri people because they're the primary victims of all this violence and political upheaval. They're being used as a proxy piece in the greater Indo-Pakistani relationship and conflict. So what are the solutions? It'd be pretty sad if I just told you all the issues and didn't give you any solutions. So here's some of the solutions that I was able to find during my research. Kashmiri independence. While this is not the most viable, this would be a creation of an independent, completely autonomous Kashmiri state, free from any rule of Pakistan or Indian. Second, we have a more formal partition and treaty. As I said earlier, the line of control separating Kashmir is not an official international border. So through mediation through the international community, hopefully redrawing of the border and more treaties where India and Pakistan are held accountable for demilitarization and such could be attained. Thirdly is a sort of soft independence, a self-rule for the Kashmiri people. It's not as drastic as the first option, but this is most consideration by all parties involved. It would drastically reduce, I believe, the violence and tension within the area if the Kashmiri people were able to decide what they wanted for themselves. So, what's happening today? Why are we talking about it? Well, just a couple months ago, we've faced another escalation in the Kashmir region with the Pulwama attack against Central Reserve Police Force, Indian Central Reserve Police Force, by Jaish-e-Mohammed, a vehicle-borne suicide bomber, killed about 40 people and injured 35. In retaliation, the Indian Air Force set about airstrikes in Pakistan, targeting Jaish-e-Mohammed facilities. Estimated 20 dead, but for obvious reasons, Pakistan did not like India invading their airspace. So, since then, there have been border clashes throughout the last couple months, which have fortunately cooled down. Heavy exchange of artillery fire, small arms fire, with 4 civilian deaths, 11 wounded, and 12 military personnel dead. Unfortunately, as this violence has reoccurred throughout the last 71 years, this new violence has created an opportunity to educate as well as giving the international community a chance at hopefully creating lasting and permanent peace in the region. And I hope as more educated world citizens, we can reach an end to this violence. Thank you.
Now, we're going to move westward into Lavant area and a fascinating presentation on Syria, Iraq, and Ba'ath Party on the rise of nationalism in Arab world.
There we go. All right. Hello, everyone. My name is Jacob O'Neill. I'm also a senior here at the University of Montana. I'm a dual major in history and economics with a minor in the Central and Southwest Asian Studies Department. And today I'd like to talk about one of the most important political movements in the history of the modern Middle East, the Arab Ba'ath Party. Specifically, I'd like to talk about their rise to power. So where do they begin? Well, the Ba'ath Party began in a rather unassuming location, considering how significant they became to the modern Arab world. Is the mic working? Yeah. With 2 school teachers, of all people, by the name of Michel Aflaq and Salah al-Din al-Bitar. They were both educated in France at the Sorbonne, both achieving the equivalent of a master's degree. They were both committed nationalists who began their careers advocating for an extreme communistic view of Syria, with the ideal of essentially bringing Syria into a state similar to that of the Soviet Union. And they both advocated for the violent overthrow of the French colonial government. After their time in France, they returned to Syria, where they both taught at one of the most prestigious high schools. Is it not working? Oh, okay. Here, let's see if I can adjust there. Is that better? Yeah. Perfect. Sorry about that. And as I was saying, they both returned from France with some new ideas about the best way to move forward for Syria. In their time in Europe, the two had both gained a love for fascism and the Nazi Party, seeing National Socialism and radical forms of nationalism as the way forward. The thing which inspired the two to move forward with an actual plan to create a party, however, was a pair of events that took place during the early wars of World War II. The first of which being France's quick defeat at the hands of the Germans. At At the time, Syria was a military-occupied state under the control of the French. Their complete humiliation at the hands of the Germans convinced many in Syria that they would have a decent chance of overthrowing the French colonial regime if they decided to take up armed revolt. And then a year later, in Iraq, a man by the name of Rashid al-Gaylani took arms against the British government there and very nearly succeeded in overthrowing the country. The only way that the British were able to suppress his revolt was with the moving in of Indian troops. And these events convinced the pair that they needed to professionally advocate for political change in Syria. And so by the beginning of 1942, both men decided that they would form an actual party and they would move forward with an effort to gain political power in Syria. And this Ba'ath movement began with a trio of constitutional principles. The first being the value of the unity and freedom of the Arab nation. As Aflaq and Bitar saw it, the Arab people belonged to a massive nation, spanning from Turkey in the north, south to Yemen, all the way west to the Maghreb, and east to the edge of Persia. They thought that if they could unify the Arab world into a singular state, they could form a third power similar to what we saw during the Cold War between the Soviet Union and the United States. And they believed that they would be able to succeed in this because they thought that the Arab nation had a unique character. After all, the Arab people had given the world Islam, they had given the world the Caliphate, they had given the world thousands of scientific and medical and technological discoveries over the course of more than a millennium. And Aflaq and Bitar supposed that if they could reunify the state, they could bring more of that success to the world at the hands of a united Arab nation. They finally believed in the eternal mission of the Arab nation, a dedication to the idea that Arab people needed to spread their superior culture and way of life to the entire world. If they could do that, they could bring this superior character to all of the people of humankind. And when they laid out their constitution, they had a few governmental policies aimed at achieving this goal. First, they were pan-Arab. They believed that the party needed at all times to move towards the unification of all Arab peoples. They were quite secular. They believed in the Arab nation as a nation of peoples, not a nation of religions. Aflaq, for example, was an Orthodox Christian despite living in predominantly Islamic Syria. And they believed that people of all faiths had a role to play in the creation of a pan-Arab state. They were anti-colonial in that they wished to remove economic and military influence from the region to allow the Arab people to govern themselves again because they hadn't been able to since before the rise of the Ottomans. All of this in and of itself sounds like an excellent idea, but the corruption comes in when you realize the mechanism they wish to use to achieve this goal. As I mentioned earlier, Aflaq and Bitar were enamored with the ideas of National Socialism, fascism, and Nazism, and they believed that adopting those fascistic ideas to the Arab world would be the best way forward for success. They believed in military autocracy, and they only used democracy in the extent that it would allow them to get in a position to seize power. And so the two began to move forward, and as the 1940s progressed, they steadily gained power, particularly after 1946, when the French, in the wake of World War II and facing a crisis in Vietnam, completely extricate themselves from Syria. The party is formally founded in 1947 with about 300 members signing on to the initial constitution. The party experiences steady growth throughout the 1940s, and there are multiple election attempts that see several thousand votes go the way of the Ba'athists. In this time, they never achieve electoral office, but they do attain a significant degree of ever-increasing success. However, that all comes to a screeching halt in 1949, when the new state experiences a trio of coups all within 5 months of each other. In March, Husni al-Zaim overthrows the civilian government, followed rapidly in August by one of his own supporters, Hinawi, overthrowing him, and ending the year out with a third coup with a man named Adib Shishakli, pictured here, gaining control of the country. He would end up holding Syria until 1954, and in that time he became a despotic military dictator. He outlawed all civilian parties that were not formally associated with the military, and he detained hundreds of political activists, among them Bitar and Aflaq. They were imprisoned for close to 2 years during this period, and they only managed to escape his thumb when they managed to convince guards to help them break out of prison in late 1952. Ironically, that would prove to be one of the best things that could have happened to them, because when they flee Syria in 1952, they meet a man by the name of Akram Harani hiding in Lebanon. He had founded another National Socialist Party in Syria, It was a very popular strain in their politics at the time. And he had strong support among military officers, particularly those who were opposed to the coups in 1949. By 1952, however, he had fallen afoul of the dictatorship, and he too had been exiled to Lebanon. While there, his party was desperate to find allies. As far as anyone in Syria could tell, the dictatorship would be in power indefinitely. And so he approached the Ba'ath in an effort to merge their two parties. The Ba'ath, of course, readily accepted this proposition, as at the time the Arab Socialist Party was much larger than the Ba'ath. And they moved forward with a merger that would see their membership increase by more than 2,000% over the course of a single month. This event was what ultimately allowed the Ba'ath to seize power in the country, as it gave them thousands of supporters among the military they'd never been able to reach in the years leading up to this merger. And by 1954, the two parties together, alongside several other civilian political groups, had formed enough of a support base that they were ready to retake Syria and overthrow the dictator. In February of 1954, the three men all cross back into Syria and unify up with a column of supporting military troops and march on Damascus. Fearing a civil war, Shashakli flees the country, and the Ba'ath return, no longer the splinter party they were prior to the dictatorships, but now as a significant part of the people who just saved the country from military oppression. And that gives a substantial boost to their popularity, making them rapidly become the largest party in Syria. In 1956, another event occurs which even further establishes Arab nationalism as a main vein in Syrian politics, with the Suez Crisis. The crisis, though we know today was largely a battle between America and her allies over policy in the Middle East, was seen at the time in the Middle East as evidence for the potential success of nationalism. After all, Nasser had just kicked out France, Britain, and Israel from his country, and he'd proven that Arab people could not only fight off Europeans, they could win and they could bloody the noses of their one-time colonizers on the world stage. That shoots him to international prominence, and it gives the people of Syria a sense that they, too, can have the Arab unity that many of them long for. It makes the Ba'ath seem like the natural progression for the country. And by the end of 1956, many people within Syria, among both the Ba'ath and others, began to advocate for the creation of a pan-Arab republic, beginning with the political union of Syria and Egypt. This republic, at the time, seemed like the next step for the Ba'ath eventually unifying the entire world. However, after a period of early enthusiasm, when the Ba'ath expected to be made partners, they expected Syria to be treated as an equal member, and they expected nationalism to be dominant within the region. They found quickly that Nasser had no plans for that. He was a dictator at heart, and he used the merger as a way to dominate Syria. They were only given a third of the unified parliament, they were relegated to provincial status, and all civilian parties, including the Ba'ath, were banned, resulting in a rapid disintegration of the civilian side of the Ba'ath party. This, of course, led to a massive wave of cynicism and resentment in Syria, and by the end of 1961, they had overthrown the Syrian or the Egyptian authorities and reinstated the pre-UAR government back into the country. For about 2 years, Syria trucks along in a relatively stable state until the early months of 1963, when coups occur in both Iraq and Syria, both of them helmed by Ba'ath military supporters. In the case of Iraq, they overthrow the dictatorship of Karim Qasim, who had been in power for about 5 years at that point, though this coup only holds power for about 9 months. In the Syrian case, they overthrow the post-United Arab Republic parliament, and they remain in power through to today. The Syrian civil war being fought today is with the sons and grandsons of the men who executed the coup in 1963. Now, nominally after 1963, the civilian Ba'ath were allowed to rule, but by this point, the party was effectively dead. The UAR had collapsed internal support. All branches of the party in foreign nations, Libya, Jordan, Lebanon, had lost contact with the main branch, and the sentiments in the country had turned against Arab nationalism. They had tried that experiment, and all they'd become was a province in someone else's empire. People turned against the idea of unifying the Arab world into one state. And by 1963, Harani also abandons the party, taking with him nearly 2/3 of what remains of the civilian support base. There are a series of power struggles which occur between 1963 and 1966, but by February of that year, the military has had enough of dealing with the civilian party in any capacity, and seeing how little support they have, they decide to execute a coup. They jail many of the supporters of Bitar and Aflaq. Aflaq and Bitar flee the country, later to be assassinated in Iraq and in France, and the military asserts control, putting a dictator by the name of Salah Jadid in power. Meanwhile, paralleling this, the Ba'ath are regaining authority in Iraq. Their support there had always been largely among the military, and so by 1968, they're ready to execute a second coup to regain control of the country. Between their coup in 1963 and 1968, Iraq was extremely unstable. The country suffered from Kurdish rebellions in the north and from numerous political divides in the south. And military revolts escalate into essentially a multi-fronted civil war by 1968. And at that point, the Ba'ath see an opportunity to invade the country and to assert their control over the region with the imposition of a new dictatorship. And so by July 17th, a man named Ahmad Hassan al-Bakr takes full control over the country and allows the Ba'ath to rapidly consolidate their power over the entire nation. So at this point, you would imagine, with Ba'ath dictatorships in both Syria and Iraq, with full control over the country and the civilian governments completely dissolved, that they would form into a unified state and continue the dream of Arab nationalism. Unfortunately, and as anyone who studied the Middle East recently knows, that did not happen. Instead, a pair of dictators take power and rapidly turn the countries into closed military states. In the case of Syria, after 4 years in power, Salah Jadid is overthrown by a man named Hafez Assad, the father of the current dictator, who overthrows him in 1970 and imposes a military regime that is still in power today. In the case of Iraq, al-Bakr is allowed to reign for longer than Jadid and remains in power until 1979, at which point the infamous Saddam Hussein takes power in a brutal dictatorship change of authority in 1979. The two, once in power, turn against each other radically, and at several points nearly come to war with hundreds of people dying in border skirmishes. Ultimately, the effect of the Ba'ath movement was to normalize fascism, in the Arab world, and to create support for military dictatorships, with the ideal of a pan-Arab union remaining on top of that horrible underlying structure. However, after the failure of the UAR and numerous internal conflicts, that idealism faded away to leave only a support for military dictatorship behind. That support for military dictatorship and that commitment to fascistic government is what ultimately installed the dictators that we're still dealing with on an international level today. And considering the situation in Syria, we may well see Ba'ath dictators continue to control regions of the Middle East well into the next decades.
Okay, please welcome Kelchi. We are going westward, further west into Holy Land, Israel, and then the Palestine question.
Well, I'm really wishing Professor Kia didn't put me behind that presentation. But today I'm going to present on the Israeli occupation of the West Bank from 1993 to 2018. One sec. This was my capstone project for the Central and Southwest Asian Studies program with Professor Mehrdad Kia, as well as my Davidson Honors College capstone. But a little bit about myself. I am majoring in history and Central and Southwest Asian Studies with a minor in Arabic. But I have been very interested in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict since I was about 16 years old in high school. I'm Jewish, and I regularly attend synagogue. And when I was 16 years old, a man named Gershon Baskin came over to present at the University of Montana. For those of you who may or may not know Gershon Baskin, he is an Israeli peace activist, and most famously known for being the man single-handedly responsible for the release of the Israeli soldier Gilad Shalit in 2011 from Hamas captors. And he has written numerous books and led numerous institutions on creating a solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And so I'd also lived throughout the North Africa and Middle East. And in 2015, 2016, I lived in the West Bank teaching English and doing freelance work. And just recently received a DHC undergrad research scholarship to conduct oral histories in Israel, the West Bank, and the Gaza border, and just returned last week. So my presentation is a little jumbled, but it's going to include some of this paper, which is now turned into a 60-page memoir and research paper documenting journals from my time during what was dubbed the Knife Intifada in 2015-2016, as well as the occupation in the West Bank. So why is this research important to many people? To me, it's simple to myself that this conflict is so much a part of me, yet so distant from me, and the distance from it gives me more perspective. But I also think it's incredibly important for you to understand, as Americans, both on political and human levels. On the political level, U.S. foreign policy is dominated by this conflict. It revolves around this conflict, and numerous U.S. relations depend on this. The U.S. provides over $3 billion a year in aid to Israel, which, not to demonize foreign aid, it's less than 1% of the U.S. GDP, but this significant portion is about a fifth of foreign aid. It also affects regional stability. On a historical level, it prompts the question, how do we approach history? What questions do we ask? When does history start? And on a social level and religious level, being the land of Abrahamic faith, we see a lot of hate, but we also see a lot of love. And so this is just a quote from my former Arabic professor, Brendan Work, who had also lived in Palestine, and proves further to me that living in the West Bank gives you a lot to think about in terms of human beings and what we're capable of. So, at some point, I was bound to put down my shovel and see what I had dug. Just some terminology. A settlement is the transfer of a civilian population to a conquered area using military force. Occupation, also known as belligerent occupation, is an occupying force or hostile army exercising control over a particular area. I wanted to highlight that there are numerous types of Zionists, but essentially it is that the idea of a Jewish homeland for Jewish people. This can be either religious Zionism, political Zionism, territorial or cultural. Islamist is someone who adheres to the ideas of political Islam, not Islam, and tends to be more militaristic than religious. In this paper, nothing is mentioned of civilized or terrorist. It prompts further philosophical questions, I believe. So I'll gloss over this brief history as I presented at UMCR yesterday. It took up quite a bit of time, and it's not the point of this presentation. But the point of this is that this land, this territory, has been occupied by numerous powers for centuries and has not been fully independent by one power or another for a very, very long time. What I'd like to highlight, though, is that the West Bank was under Jordanian occupation up until 1967, in which during the Six-Day War, Israel captured the West Bank. And this is when the PLO was created to combat this against Israel. And Yasser Arafat came to power. This was actually created by Gamal Abdel Nasser of Egypt as a part of Arab solidarity. And so we come to the first Intifada, which is the major Palestinian uprising against the Israeli occupation. And this was largely independent. Palestinians just took to the street without leadership. It gained mass international news. And it was a wake-up call to the international community about the occupation of the West Bank. This also prompted the 1991 Madrid Conference, where talks of land for peace first begun. But it wasn't until some secret meetings in Oslo, Norway, were conducted, and in 1993 announced between Yasser Arafat, the PLO leader, and Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin, that the first Oslo Accords were to be signed. And this is where my paper starts, is arguing that the Oslo Accords were in fact not a pathway to creating a two-state solution, but in fact the end of a two-state solution possibility. So the Oslo Accords, there was two of them. The first one in 1993 being Israel recognized the PLO as the official body of the Palestinian people and created the Palestinian Authority, and the PLO would renounce terrorism. The second Oslo Accord was signed in 1995. It's also known as the Taba Agreement, designated or outlined the first steps to creating a Palestinian state. A few of these steps were the creations of areas A, B, and C in the West Bank. And I'll go over to this slide really quick. But areas A were designated to be largely Palestinian cities, and so they would be controlled by the Palestinian Authority, both militarily, both security-wise, and under civilian law. Areas B would be under Palestinian civil law and Israeli military law, and Area C would be both under Israeli civil law and military law, this being settlements and closed military zones of the West Bank. And as you can see in this picture, the yellow areas, if I can, no? The yellow areas of the West Bank are designated to be Area C, constituting the vast majority of the West Bank. And so part of the reason this was signed was because Israel had captured originally the Sinai, but returned it to Egypt, but it also captured the Gaza Strip, the Golan Heights, and the West Bank. And this put enormous pressure on the Israeli military. And so releasing some of these areas to Palestinian control relieved that pressure put on the military. Also part of that agreement, Israeli troops would disengage from Jericho and later in 1997 from Hebron, two of the largest Palestinian cities in the West Bank. Yitzhak Rabin was later assassinated by a Jewish nationalist in 1995 for this. And this is also when the rise of Benjamin Netanyahu and Ariel Sharon take place. They are prominent right-wing Israeli politicians who both promised to slow down the Oslo Accords or discontinue them altogether. And so meanwhile, in the late 1990s, there is a debate going on of whether Oslo is actually working or not. From the Israeli side, Israelis argue that Palestinians, though individually, were still taking part in terrorist activities, and Palestinians argued that settlements were still being built in the West Bank where they shouldn't be. And so the Second Intifada begins. The actual causality of it is debated. I think the instant moment when this set off was when Prime Minister Ariel Sharon walked atop Temple Mount, which is holy to both Muslims and Jews, and is not supposed to be walked atop, in 2000. But the previous causality was these debates. And so this was largely a much bloodier intifada than the first one and received negative press coverage. Over 4,200 Palestinians were killed and 1,000 Israelis. This was when the creation of the wall took place. I'd like to highlight that the wall is twice as long as the actual Green Line. It has annexed nearly 10% of the West Bank. A lot of communities have been cut off from pasture land. And settlement expansion continues. The wall was originally created to prevent settlements, but now under right-wing leadership, it is to protect them. And so, meanwhile, I guess I'll get to the fun stuff if you guys want to check out some Gaza stuff from what I just recently did. In 2005, Israel disengaged from Gaza. They dismantled all their settlements there, which there were about 7,000 Israeli settlers living there at the time. And then Hamas took over the Gaza Strip in 2007. This was a very, very violent takeover. Fatah supporters were thrown off of roofs. And likewise in the West Bank, Fatah severely suppressed and continues to suppress Hamas. So I will get to some settlements, if you guys would like to talk about settlements. But this is in Hebron, in the Palestinian West Bank. This is Shahada Street. It had locally, It had been known to be one of the busiest and most bustling Arab streets in town, but after Israeli settlement, 700 to 800 of these streets were closed, and is now known as Apartheid Street. These are some of the settlements in Hebron. There are 5 in town with around 700 settlers and nearly double that of IDF personnel to protect them. And there are around 7,000 settlers in Kiryat Arba, the neighboring settlement. And that is the wall in Bethlehem with my little daughter on the side. And these are some barricades around the settlements, which my research further conducts. These barricades are put up to prevent Israeli settlers from throwing down trash onto the Palestinians. Sometimes they urinate on them. It is very disgusting and horrible to see. And there are Israeli checkpoints throughout Hebron because Hebron is a divided city where 80% of the city is controlled by Palestinians and 20% is controlled by the Israeli military. So this is where I lived at one point on the border of these settlements. And this was my most recent trip to the Gaza border. We toured the town of Sderot. I went alongside an Orthodox Jew who was also the founder of Jerusalem Peacemakers and a Palestinian Muslim. After trying to get into Gaza for a few months, we settled on a tour of the northern and central Gaza border. And it happened to be the day that the Israeli offensive first started off a few weeks ago. So we witnessed the first bombings after a lone Hamas missile rocket landed north of Tel Aviv early in the morning and damaged a civilian household and injured 7 people. So that night, we witnessed 4 of the 15 bombings that Israel conducted in retaliation of Gaza. These are some road closures being put up, and the Erez border crossing, which typically hosts 60,000 Palestinians each day, closed entirely to Palestinians. We talked to some Palestinian merchants who were stuck at the border and discussed the limited work permits. So essentially this is a little history of Gaza. And primarily what I want to highlight is what I had known about Gaza was tragic, but what I had seen was even more heartbreaking. 90% of the water in Gaza is undrinkable, and all of its sewage is untreated and is pouring into the Mediterranean Sea, which also proves to be problematic for both Palestinians and Israelis. Limited work permits and merchant permits further deteriorate the economic condition in Gaza. There are only 300 merchant permits allowed in Gaza, a population of 2 million. And the only reason, primarily, that Hamas agrees to ceasefire agreements with Israel is to increase these work permits. There's also limited medical permits, and Israel only accepts 50% of the ones that include companion requests. So if a child is injured and needs to go to a hospital either in Israel or the West Bank, and they need a parent to go with them, only half of them are accepted. These are some more facts about the Gaza Strip. 71% of the population is under the age of 30. So what now? Arab solidarity is dying, but with the expansion of Area C, it has made it nearly impossible to logistically dismantle Israeli settlements in the West Bank, therefore making it a one-state solution is only left. And so, as Likud maintains in power, I remain very pessimistic about this situation, and I fear the status quo will continue in the West Bank, especially with Israeli focuses on Hezbollah in Syria, as the war has been declared. The civil war in Syria has been declared over, and the U.S. has recognized the Golan Heights as Israeli sovereign territory. Well, sorry for the jumbled little presentation, but thank you.
Please welcome Isaac. Thanks.
Hi there, everybody. My name is my name is Isaac Mon. I'm not trying to get this. There we go. My name is Isaac Mon. I'm a senior here at the university studying political science and Central and Southwest Asian Studies, along with a minor in Arabic and history. And today I'm going to talk about a party in Tunisia that I studied for my capstone in Central and Southwest Asian Studies for Islam in the West with Dr. Mehrdad Kia. And so, yeah, I'll get started. So I'm going to talk about Tunisia today, this tiny little country wedged between Algeria and Libya on the border of the Mediterranean Sea. So this country, around half the size of Montana, under half the size, with over 10 times the population. So how did it get to this point that led the Arab Revolution in 2011, leading to the overthrow of many authoritarian leaders in the Arab world? So just to get you started, where I'm going for the rest of this presentation, I'm going to go through the early history of the Ennahda Party, where it started, how it started, and then how it evolved into the party it is today, into the 2011 uprisings, and then creating a constitution, accepting democracy and a secular government while adhering to his Islamic principles. So to start with, where was this party under the leader of Tunisia ending colonial rule? So their first president, Habib Bourguiba, was a revolutionary leader for the 1956 independence movement. And he promised freedom and democracy and a series of westernizing reforms, including a new constitution, a democratic election that elected him to power, and including a personal status code that was a pioneering set of laws for women's rights in comparison to other regions in the Arab world. But as his term moved on, people started to realize that he was trying to consolidate his power and was cracking down on dissent, and his modernization reforms were really more of a pseudo-modernization, similar to the reforms of the Shah in Iran, where the reforms were promised democracy and representation, yet there was a single-party system, essentially, where the other parties didn't have real political power or were associated with the regime. So, where did this leave Islam? During all of this, Bourguiba attacked the religious elite, including one of the oldest Islamic institutions and schools, Zaytuna University, and religion was forced to move underground into the private life. So, but there was a strong religious activism within Tunisia at the time that one of my main sources, Ann Wolf, credits to an increase in Muslim Brotherhood literature from Egypt, starting from the late 1960s, that encouraged people to say, hey, Islamists can have power and can have political clout. And then in 1979, the Iranian Revolution proved that Islam can move beyond like a social sphere of influence and move into the political realm and have legitimate political power. And then there was also a strong, very strong religious body within Tunisia at the time. So what started the movement was this active religious base that was based around Al-Jamia Al-Islamiyya, and it was a way to discuss them being marginalized under this Western modernized Tunisia that largely was secular and alienated this population of religious activists. But this provided also problems because it was a very split base within this activist movement where no one really agreed on anything. They were just talking in a sense of community, but had very strong divisions over certain issues like democracy and the use of violence. But anyways, as this sort of division within this activist religious body, there was a split into the Islamic Tendency movement, which later became the Ennahda Party that we know for the 2011 uprisings. And this had a split within itself after it split from the original group that was between a more dogmatic approach and a pragmatic approach. And this was characterized by an increased crackdown after 1979 by the regime that put a bunch of the members in jail or they were forced to exile. And as a result, the party had to take drastic measures. He was trying to build up a base of support in Tunisia across the universities and in the major cities. But this crackdown kind of forced them into a corner, and this became a very dark period for the group, and one that they actively tried to downplay their role, especially in some of their violent acts in the organization. Particularly after this crackdown increased, after the regime realized that they were more powerful than he thought he was. Originally, he was focusing on the leftist organizations as a real threat to his power. But the Islamists, many of the leadership was in jail around like the late 1970s to the early 1980s, and in 1986-87 they started to develop a coup plot, which brings me to the next leader, Ben Ali, which is pretty interesting, as the Islamic Tendency movement was planning a coup so that their leaders would not be executed by the end of the year in 1987. Ben Ali got word of this movement. He had been secretly developing his own coup for several months, and he rapidly accelerated that plan. And the day before the Islamic Tendency movement planned their coup, he executed his coup and took over. So his first year, he declared to have more democratic principles, including incorporating a multi-party system, and planned to not exile the Islamic community within Tunisia and not repeat the mistakes of his predecessor. But from this, he created a law that new political parties had to be separate from forming based on religious, racial, ethnic, territorial grounds. And so the Ennahda Party became what it is out of that. And Ennahda means the Renaissance, so the Renaissance Party distanced itself from its Islamic roots. So in 1989, it decided to take a more dogmatic approach and ran for elections in every seat it could find. And it did relatively well, although Ben Ali was more successful. And after that, his crackdown on the group drastically increased. And this led to two results for the party. They either became prisoners under the regime, subject to humiliating and brutal tactics in the prisons, where they wouldn't receive health care, they'd be tortured, they didn't talk to their families, and some people were in prison for over 10 years. And then there was an identity crisis, too, among the families, where the children were struggling to figure out who they were without a father and why they were being attacked by this government. And then the other option was forced into exile, which is where the leader of this movement really took over and became the leader after the 2011 uprisings. So, moving into exile, they were forced to develop a new plan, as all their networks that they had set up in Tunisia were no longer really active or allowed to be active due to a security network that monitored their activities. The leadership transferred abroad to this man, Rashid Ghannouchi, and he really changed the party to what it would later become after the uprisings in 2011 by accepting the principle of nonviolence. So also there were some changing attitudes in Tunisia at the time. They were questioning these westernized reforms and wondering, you know, this is promised to us, but that's not what's going on when a president is winning 90% of the vote every election. Like, this isn't democracy. And also, they were starting to become more religiously active, but in a lot of terms, this was a resistance to the government that they saw was cracking down on not just the Islamists, but the left. And they started to wear the veil, even if they weren't practicing, as a sort of symbolic resistance to the regime. So during the uprisings, this party came back to power, although it had a minimal role in the actual uprisings. After the uprisings, it came to the polls, and during the elections, it won 37% of the vote, which is more than the other 8 parties combined. And it formed a coalition government called Troika between 2 other parties, and they worked to create this constitution in 2014 that guaranteed gender equality and women's rights, rights to religious expression, but also accepting a secular government, not adhering to Sharia law explicitly, and then it was also a democratic system. So a few of the problems with this are there was widespread Salafi violence during this time, many bombings on tourist areas, and this created a division within Ennahda, trying to distance themselves from this group that was also Islamic. And along with this, youth disillusionment and radicalization led to the Salafi movement. People who were not allowed to talk about politics in the open and weren't allowed to practice religion were forced into this little box and bubble, and they felt like the only option was to turn to the most extreme means. And also with this new system, when they were used to an oppressive regime, is they have to deal with their own problems now in a multi-party system where not everyone agrees, and there's still this split between the secular side and the Islamic side. And also the economic conditions that led to the revolutions also weren't getting better and still are creating many problems within the country. And beyond this, there were many institutions still left by the previous regimes, primarily the security sector, which was instrumental in cracking down on dissent and jailing Islamists. And these people are still around as long as the institutions. And one of my main sources in this, Noordin Jebnoon, goes into great depth talking about this sector still being around without any accountability, and that's something they need to deal with before this can get better. That's something that could bite them later on. So to sum it up, in the future, what they need to do is agree to a coalition that deals with things on the ground like economic prosperity that modern Tunisians have, through the polls, have shown that they're dissatisfied still with the political system. So they need to adhere to this and create some jobs through coalition building. But also, the sign of Ennahda and the Islamist Party, they gained control in a democratic government, agreed to a democratic government with multi-party, secular government, is very important for the rest of the region and the rest of the world, Islamic world, in this idea of a Muslim democrat versus a political Islamist who wants to create absolute power. Thank you.
Now we are going to the heart of Eurasia, and please welcome Chris.
All right. Can you all hear me okay? Let's make it this right. Hi, my name is Chris Hansen. I'm a grad student here under the Central and Southwest Asia program, which is under the umbrella of anthropology, so it kind of goes back and forth. I did graduate here with my undergrad in Central and Southwest Asian Studies as well as anthropology under the emphasis on archaeology, and I also did a minor in history and Arabic. And I have spent time in Egypt, living there, studying Arabic, and I have to say I'm quite rusty right now on it. So any of my Arabic pronunciations I give here, I apologize for that. Anyways, the title of my presentation here is Faurecia, Monkeys on Horseback, and I'm sure you've all read the title here. It's from Al-Basri, a 9th century or 10th century poet who despised a group of people that he calls monkeys on horseback, and I'll mention them here in just a moment. I have just a few minutes, so I'm going to run through the slides pretty fast. But first, I want to give you some geography on the areas I'm talking about, and the people I'm talking about are the Mamluks of Syria and Egypt, the Mongols who are coming from Central Asia. Then there's the Kipchaks. They're in the red. The Mongols are in the yellow, and the Mamluks are the ones in the green. And everything centers, probably Baghdad is the place to give the central focal point. And the Kipchaks are just a confederation of tribes up in the Central Asia plain. You'll hear the term Kuman that the Russians give and the Hungarians also give. The Arabs call them Kipchaks. You also hear the Eastern Kipchaks called the Kangli, and the Russians call them Poloskis. Anyways, in the Arab world, if anybody takes the Islamic civilization, you'll hear the term men of religion, those who are studying Islam and writing about it. There's also a group of people, men of the pen. These are the ones writing poetry and Faurecia, which I'm going to talk about. And then there are the monkeys on horseback, a.k.a. the Turks. And these are the men of the sword. The thing about the Turks, the Kipchaks, is they're well known for their military prowess. So the Arabs and the Persians are bringing these people in and using them for their battles. Faurecia, it comes out in the Abbasid Caliph around the 8th century, and the term is really equestrian martial exercise. You've heard the French term chivalric, or in Europe, chivalry. It's not quite the same, but it's very, very similar. It is a code of ethics for these slave soldiers that I'll talk about here in a moment that they are to abide by, and it's the same as the knights of medieval Europe, and they do converge together inside the Levant during the Crusades. Anyways, Faurecia stands for a lot of writing on horse care, horsemanship, archery, and about a third of the Faurecia writings are definitely on archery. Anyways, there is a strong influence from the Greek sources, meaning Byzantium, the Eastern Roman Empire, as well as the Sassanids that were taken over by the Arabs in the 12th century. The two pictures that you see on here, in the top is a group of Turkish soldiers practicing a game called Kabek, in which they shoot at a gourd up on top of a pole. Down at the bottom are two soldiers. The pyramids are actually clay, and their job every day and during training was to take a sword and cut into this clay. They first start out with deep cuts, and over time has to go shallower and shallower. And the reason being is, during the medieval period, it wasn't always advantageous to kill everyone. You do want to capture people for ransom. It was the same in medieval Europe. All right, slave soldiers, Mamluks, Gulams. Anyways, these people are coming about. These are the Turks I just mentioned earlier. They're brought in. The Kipchaks are the primary ones that are brought in. And they're sold into slave markets such as Bukhara, Merv, Samarkand, Herat, Damascus, Halab, which is the Arabic word for Aleppo, and Cairo. And they're sold around the ages of 10 and 12 years of old. At 12 years of age, they are indoctrinated into the realm of Islam, converted to Muslims, and they're also then trained for several years on how to fight on horseback and so forth. And the reason why these Kipchak Turks are preferred is they start out as youths. They learn to ride a horse. There are plenty of documents from Europe, China, and the Persian sources that are saying these young kids learn to ride a horse before they learn how to walk. They're also learning arts of archery, and they start out as a 10-year-old, and by the time they're a 10-year-old, they can pull a pretty hefty bow and are very good at hunting. Anyways, the term Ghulam is probably the initial term that you hear on there. It just means boys, young youth, and you'll see that term even into about the 1100s, and then you start seeing the term Mamluk. It comes from the root Malik, which means to own or to possess, and I think the best term comes from a professor at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, Professor Amitai, and he uses the term to be controlled. These guys are slaves, But there's one little catch. In Islam, one Muslim cannot keep another Muslim enslaved. They are freed afterwards. However, most of these Mamluks stay with the owner and actually fight with him. And when he dies, they usually go on and take their allegiance to the next person who supersedes him. Anyways, the Furusiya writings that I mentioned earlier here start out in about the 9th century with Ibn Akhi Hazim. And he's a commander in the Khorasani Corps. Khorasan is a region south of the Caspian, or not Caspian Sea, but the Aral Sea, east of the Caspian Sea. And lots of troops are brought into that area. There's a book here. It's Kitab al-Farsiya wal Baitara. What that translates to is Kitab is book. I prefer the term treatise. I think is a much better term. And the reason being is these writings are not written like a book that you would say. It's actually poems. And they rhyme, and I'll mention earlier how sometimes it can be really annoying. Farasiya, as I mentioned earlier, is just equestrian, and Baitara is horse care. And each of these soldiers, the Mamluks, were required to have an extensive amount of knowledge of how to care for their horse. All right, and if you want it in Latin letters, there's Kitab al-Farsiya wal Baitara. And a picture there, just so you know, is in an area called Samarra, and it's north of Baghdad, and this is where the Caliph starts there. But he has a problem with these Turks, as I mentioned earlier in my quote about them being monkeys on horseback. The reason why the Arabs and a Persian didn't like them is these guys never dismounted. And it states in the times, even if you read on the Crusades, when the Mamluks are entering cities, they don't want to get off their horses. And in one phrase during the Saladin, you may have heard his name in the movie Kingdom of Heaven, they don't want to dismount. In fact, they make it very disdain. It was the same for the medieval knights. You don't dismount unless their horse is dead, and they absolutely have to. But anyways, the Caliph moves his Turks up to an area in Samarra. It's about 78, 80 miles north of Baghdad. And during the reign of Saddam Hussein, he was trying to revive the city and bring back the old glory. All right, moving on here. Treatises or manuals about military is nothing new. In Europe, there's Publius Flavius Vegetius Renatus, and we prefer to, or you'll say it, Vegetius. He is a Roman that wrote on two things. A veterinarian is the best way to describe it, horse care, animal care, as well as de re military, which is concerning military thing. Even today in U.S. and British academies, they have to read the de re military. And this is 4th century. When the Roman Empire breaks apart, in the east, Constantinople, they start writing their treatises dealing with different groups of people who are invading, especially the nomadic tribes from the north and from Central Asia. And there's the Strategikon, and this is from Emperor Maurice in the late 6th century. His brother writes about it, and then all the commanders are required to read it. The first one, Vegetius, is in Latin, whereas Strategikon is in Greek. And the Strategikon was also translated into Arabic. Europeans are not the only one writing these treatises. Also in China, there is the Wujing Zongyao. This is a Sung dynasty in the 11th century. What is very significant about this, and it's not in English, but you can get a hold of it. It's 2 thick books. It does have the recipe for gunpowder. And I do like World War II, and I've watched a lot of videos about the, I'll call it propaganda, what the United States put out to the public. And one of the things that they state is the Chinese were very peaceful, and throughout their time period they invented gunpowder, but it was never used in times of warfare, of course, which is totally absurd. We know for a fact it was, all the way back in the 11th century. Anyways, there's also another Greek source, Strategikon, and British commander. In the 11th century, he really focuses on with the invasion of the Turks and how to fight them. All right. The treatises, the Furusiya treatises really expand in the 11th century, or excuse me, the 12th century with Salah ad-Din. And I am not going to read these titles here. A friend of mine who I had proofread my PowerPoint, he's a retired military and officer, and he griped about all these words on here. And I just told him, you know, welcome to Arabic writing, and that's the way their titles are. Ibn Qalanisi, an 11th century chronicler, he apologizes in his book right off the bat. He will not put the title of Zengi, his full title, because if he was, he would never have enough room on the page to write his narrative. Anyways, what's significant about the writings of like Al-Harari this is the one I spent time translating. I haven't translated the entire thing, but what's interesting about this guy is he moves from Herat, Afghanistan, to Halab or Aleppo, but he's a loner. He complains about he's not married, he has no kids, no family, and no friends. But he does write a treatise for Salah ad-Din. Another one by Tarsusi, What's significant about this is there's a depiction, which is the bottom picture, of what they call a counterweight trebuchet. Trebuchets were a swing arm to launch rocks up onto the castles, fortresses, and they were invented in China, and it was mass amount of men that would pull down on the ropes, and that technology moves west all the way into Europe. But it is in the Middle East where they started putting these buckets on the end, loading them up with rocks, lead, whatever, and during the era of the Crusades. And then that technology heads east with the Mongols into China, and then from the Crusaders into Europe. All right, another Saphira, if you get into archery like I have, and you'll run across several treatises. One is Taibuga, and even the Girl Scouts. They even recommend it in their little archery program that they're to read it. It's a Saracen archery. This is written in English. You can read through that. There's also Umar ibn Ibrahim. His is translated from a guy at Scotland in Cairo. And if you've ever read Sun Tzu, The Art of War, this manual reads very much like that. Know yourself and know thy enemy. It makes me wonder if the Arabs did have a copy of that Chinese source. Anyways, and the last one is the Arab archery, Arab manuscript, about 1500s. This one I've been reading through, and it gets to be kind of annoying because at the end of every paragraph or each topic, he ends it with the Arabic phrase is wathaliku thalik, which is, and that is that. You'll read through it, and that is that. It's like, gosh, just leave it out. Anyways, you can get these in English. Anyways, as I was saying, they are written in more of a poetic style. Going in hand-to-hand with first here reading are poems about jihad. And you pay people like Kitab al-Jihad, which is the book of jihad written in the 11th century by Salami. He's pretty much ignored in the early half of the 1100s, but later on his poetry becomes more and more predominant with the rise against the Crusaders. And then you see Abu Muzaffar al-Barwadi, and he writes the poem, This is War, and it's basically the call to arms to rise up against the Crusaders, and later the Mongols, which brings us to Ibn Taymiyyah. Ibn Taymiyyah writes a series of fatwas, why they should fight against the Mongols. There's a huge problem with the Mongols. When they move into modern-day Iran, Iraq, they sack Baghdad in 1258, they convert to Islam. Now there's a problem. The Mamluks of Syria and Egypt, are they supposed to conflict and fight against the Mongols, who are actually fighting against them, or should they be going against the Crusaders? So Ibn Taymiyyah gives a series of justifications with the fatwas. For example, he states that the Mongols follow the Yasa, which are the dictations of Genghis Khan. And, of course, there's the joke that the Yasa actually rhymes with the Arabic word of government or politics, siyasa, which, of course, the Arabs don't buy. And then he says that the Mongols are from Jahiliyyah, which, if you're familiar with that term, which is ignorance before the time of Islam. And he declares that the Muslims can declare jihad against them. Anyways, coming up on my last slide here. Why is this significant today? People such as Osama bin Laden with Al-Qaeda are actually quoting from, especially Taymiyyah. And even more recently, which was mentioned earlier, with the Ba'ath Party, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi with ISIL, or ISIS, you may have heard him, he was using it for his justification as the Caliph, the so-called Caliph. All right, the last slide I'll let you read. It's up for Sia, but it goes back to the Turks. To give you an example here, even in the medieval period, they had that stereotypical view on the Turks. It still exists today. When I was living in Egypt, talking to my friends there at a coffee shop, I brought up the Turks. Everyone at the table just went totally quiet, and one of them pointed at me, yes, you don't trust the Turks. They're foreigners. They have their own weird misconception of Islam. Don't trust them. And with that, I'll leave you there to read the quote. Thanks.
Thank you so much, panel. As promised and as I told you, this was an elite force that did a wonderful job. So we have a little bit of time for a couple questions, but then a couple comments before the questions is that, first and foremost, tomorrow we're going to be, I noticed that there's so much talk about rise of nationalism and extremism within the area, so there's going to be a talk actually at between 1 to 2 on centrality of Central Asia, but at the same time, since there were students who wanted to talk a little bit about the rise of nationalism in Turkey and Iran, there's going to be, I give one of the students a little bit more time. Carson is going to be talking about rise of nationalism in Turkey and Iran. So if you are interested, tomorrow, Friday, 1 to 2, I'm going to be talking a little bit about centrality of Central Asia, but then otherwise, the rise of nationalism. The other thing is so much talk about religion and conflict between religions, and no talk about, well, what happens to ethics and moral conduct, respect or understanding for the other. So let's open up to some questions, and please, there is a microphone there if you want to address a general question, or you have personally you have someone that you want to question about that presentation. Please come forward and have your question.
I had a question about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. What do the right-wingers in Israel want to do with the Palestinians?
That's a good question. I think there are many debates within the right-wing community about that. And it depends kind of what group or what culture they belong to in Israel, whether they're very nationalistic and believe in annexing the West Bank for security reasons, or whether they're very religious Zionists and believe in Judea-Samaria revivalism. So there's a lot of rhetoric that goes on about Muslims being awful and this evil in Israel. There's a lot of talk from the religious right of kicking them out, that killing is permissible, and you see that in a lot of settler attacks. There's a lot of settler car rammings in the West Bank that go on, and stabbings. But then you also see in 2008 there was an amendment to the citizenship law, which said that you could, in effect, take away an Israeli Arab citizenship if you could prove that they had distrust or betrayal to the state of Israel. So that's been invoked a couple of times, not many. But there's also the nation-state law, and you just see this increasing rhetoric that tries to dislocate and disenfranchise, particularly Israeli Arab citizens, but as well as in the West Bank, you see this tighter concentration into cities, like in areas A, like Bethlehem. And I think that's the main goal of Israeli politicians in Likud right now, is to concentrate Palestinian populations into the tightest spaces that they can. One of the books that I read for this research project described it as the right-wing idea or solution to this would be little Bantuistans of Palestinian pockets in the West Bank that had somewhat autonomy. But that's it.
Questions?
Yes, I've got a question for the individual who talked about the Pakistani-India problem. And after that Indian jet was shot down, there was quite a bit of news on that. And that just a few months ago, wasn't it, when all that happened?
Yeah, that was probably the peak of the escalation of this 2019 standoff.
Yeah. There was a lot of talk about nuclear weapons going on, and I know between the two, there's probably a couple hundred nuclear weapons or more, at least that we know of, and there's probably more that we don't know of. So there was a lot of enthusiasm, and I can't tell if it was just on the Pakistani side or was it just strictly on the Indian side, but there were generals cheerleading for the use of using nuclear weapons to solve the problem. And that really rose a flag in my consciousness as far as trying to understand the situation. So the question I might ask is, how likely, what is the likelihood that that could possibly happen?
Yeah, that's a great question, and also a terrifying question. I'm no expert on the situation, but while some, war hawkish generals may cheer for it, and this has been the rhetoric previously, this very violent rhetoric. With this new escalation that we've seen in the last couple months, there also has been it's a softer voice, but it's gaining momentum for now we're in a standoff again. This is an opportunity to finally get some sustainable peace. So I truly hope there's never any use of nuclear weapons against anybody in this conflict. But like you said, there are hundreds of warheads that each country has. So I guess we'll have to wait and see. But I'm hopeful.
I think we have time for one more question if anybody wants to. No more questions? Okay, thank you so much. And the next panel is going to be here shortly, so Russia, United States, and Middle East. So thank you so much, panel.